By sunrise, every barn in Pine Hollow had either collapsed or vanished beneath the snow. Every barn except hers. The strange part was that Evelyn Carter had never built one. 4 months earlier, she arrived in the valley driving a rusted pickup truck loaded with tools, feed sacks, and nearly everything she owned. Behind it rattled a livestock trailer carrying 12 goats, 6 sheep, and 2 old horses. People stepped onto their porches to watch her pass. Everyone knew the property she had bought. It was a narrow strip of abandoned farmland pressed against the northern side of a steep hill. The fences leaned toward the ground. The well pump groaned with every pull. The cabin roof had been repaired with mismatched sheets of metal, and there was no barn. In Pine Hollow, winter did not forgive mistakes. By November, the wind came down from the northern ridge hard enough to break branches. By January, snow could bury roads overnight. Every farmer in the valley knew that livestock without shelter could freeze before morning. Mr. Holloway visited Evelyn on her second day. He owned the largest cattle farm in the valley, along with a red barn so tall it could be seen from the county road. 3 neighbors stood behind him, staring at Evelyn's animals as if they were already counting the losses. "You know winter is coming," Holloway said. Evelyn continued repairing a section of fence. "I know. You have animals." "I noticed." A few of the men smiled. Holloway looked across the empty pasture. "Then where's your barn?" Evelyn stopped working. She turned toward the steep hill behind the cabin. "There." For several seconds, no one spoke. The hillside held nothing except weeds, exposed stone, and old maple trees twisted by decades of wind. Then one of the men laughed. By the end of the week, the entire valley had heard about the woman who believed a hill could become a barn. Some said she had been cheated when she bought the farm. Others believed she was too proud to admit she could not afford proper shelter. Trucks slowed near her gate, and laughter drifted through open windows. Evelyn never confronted them. Each morning, she climbed the hill carrying a notebook, a shovel, and a length of rope. She watched where rainwater disappeared into the soil. She marked the places where frost melted first. Most importantly, she studied where the animals stood whenever the northern wind began to rise. The neighbors thought she was searching for a place to build a barn. They were wrong. Evelyn was not looking for empty ground. She was looking for the hidden entrance to a shelter that had been waiting beneath their feet all along. 3 days later, Evelyn began cutting into the hillside. She started with a narrow trench above the cabin, following the curve of the slope rather than digging straight into it. By noon, the sound of her shovel striking stone had carried across the valley. Mr. Holloway arrived first. He parked beside the gate and watched as Evelyn hauled dirt into a wooden cart. Behind her, a dark opening had begun to appear beneath the roots of the old maple trees. "You're digging a cellar?" he asked. "An animal shelter." He stared at her, waiting for the joke. When none came, he stepped closer. "Inside the hill?" Evelyn nodded. By evening, 3 more neighbors had come to see. One called it a burrow. Another asked whether she planned to raise goats or moles. Their laughter followed her long after their trucks disappeared down the road. But Evelyn kept working. She widened the entrance and carved 2 connected chambers into the slope. The first would hold feed, tools, and water barrels. The second would become the sleeping area for the goats and sheep. She used salvaged timber from an abandoned shed to brace the ceiling and stacked flat stones along the walls where the soil was loose. The hill was not easy to shape. Roots twisted through the ground like rope. Hidden rocks broke the edge of her shovel. Twice, small sections of dirt collapsed, forcing her to rebuild the supports. At night, her hands shook from exhaustion. Still, every morning she returned. She knew an underground shelter could become dangerous if it was poorly designed. Moisture could collect. Air could turn stale. Heavy rain could flood the floor. So she dug a drainage channel along the back wall, raised the sleeping platforms above ground level, and left 2 narrow ventilation shafts leading toward the top of the slope. She also faced the entrance away from the strongest winter winds. The neighbors saw only a woman burying her money in a hill. Evelyn saw thick earth that could block the wind, absorb sudden changes in temperature, and protect the animals without requiring a towering wooden structure. By the end of the second week, She hung an old door across the entrance. The shelter was dark, unfinished, and rough around the edges. Mr. Holloway stood outside it and shook his head. That thing will cave in before Christmas. Evelyn brushed the dirt from her gloves. Then I'd better make sure it doesn't. Behind her, one of the goats stepped through the doorway, circled the straw-covered floor, and quietly lay down. It was the first creature in Pine Hollow that did not think Evelyn's idea was foolish. As autumn deepened, the shelter began to reveal what Evelyn had seen from the beginning. Outside, the nights grew colder. Frost whitened the pasture before sunrise, and the wind swept down from the northern ridge with enough force to rattle the cabin windows. But inside the hill, the air changed slowly. Evelyn hung a thermometer near the entrance and another at the back of the sleeping chamber. Each morning, she recorded the numbers in her notebook. Even when the temperature outside dropped sharply, the rear chamber remained noticeably warmer. The earth surrounding the shelter absorbed heat during the day and released it gradually through the night. It did not make the chamber hot, but it softened the extremes. The animals were protected from sudden wind, freezing drafts, and the rapid temperature changes that made open barns difficult to manage. Yet warmth was only part of the design. Evelyn watched the walls closely after every rainfall. Where moisture gathered, she widened the drainage trench and packed gravel beneath the floor. She covered the raised sleeping platforms with dry straw and replaced any damp bedding before it could begin to smell. The ventilation shafts were equally important. One opening drew fresh air from near the entrance. The second allowed warm, moist air to escape higher on the slope. Evelyn tested the airflow with a thin strip of cloth, watching it flutter gently beneath the shaft. Too little ventilation could make the shelter unhealthy. Too much could turn it into a wind tunnel. The balance had to be exact. At first, the animals hesitated to enter the deeper chamber. The goats stopped near the doorway, staring into the darkness. So Evelyn installed small reflective panels that carried daylight farther inside and hung an oil lantern behind a protective metal screen. She also began feeding the animals near the rear wall. Within days, their fear disappeared. The goats chose the highest sleeping platform. The sheep gathered in the warmest corner. Even the two old horses began standing beneath the covered outer section whenever the wind rose. Evelyn learned something from every choice they made. The animals showed her where cold air settled, where water collected, and which areas felt safest. Instead of forcing them to use the shelter according to her original plan, she adjusted the design around their behavior. One evening, Mr. Holloway stopped by as the first snowflakes drifted across the valley. He stood at the doorway and looked inside. The animals were resting quietly. The walls were dry. A soft current of fresh air moved through the chamber, carrying the smell of straw rather than damp earth. For the first time, he did not laugh. He placed one hand against the stone wall and felt the steady warmth held inside it. Then he looked back at the frozen pasture. Evelyn had not simply dug a hole into the hill. She had learned how to make the hill breathe. The first real test came in early December. For 3 days, freezing rain fell over Pine Hollow. Water ran down the hillside, turned to ice along the fences, and sealed the pasture beneath a hard silver crust. At first, Evelyn believed the shelter was holding. The animals were dry, the temperature remained steady, and the drainage trench carried most of the runoff away from the sleeping chamber. Then, shortly after midnight, she heard the goats crying. Evelyn pulled on her boots, grabbed a lantern, and ran through the freezing rain. Inside the shelter, a thin stream of muddy water was creeping across the floor from the rear wall. A buried root channel had opened beneath the saturated soil. Within minutes, one corner of the bedding was soaked. Evelyn moved the sheep and goats onto the raised platforms, then began digging through the mud with a hand shovel. The water was icy enough to numb her fingers through her gloves. By dawn, she had opened a temporary channel toward the entrance. The shelter had not flooded, but the damage was clear. When Mr. Holloway drove past and saw piles of wet straw outside, he slowed his truck. "Still think the hill is your barn?" he called. Evelyn did not answer. She spent the next 2 days rebuilding the rear drainage system. She lined the trench with stone, added a bed of gravel, and dug a second overflow channel to redirect water around the shelter before it reached the walls. But the rain exposed only the first weakness. A week later, the entrance door froze shut after melting snow collected beneath the hinges. Evelyn had to strike the ice with an axe while frightened goats pushed from inside. Then she discovered that the reflective panels did not provide enough light during the shortest days of winter. The animals became restless in the deeper chamber, and one young goat refused to leave the doorway. Each failure gave the neighbors another reason to laugh. Each failure gave Evelyn another problem to solve. She raised the door above ground level, built a sloping stone threshold, and added an inner wooden gate that could open even if the outer entrance became blocked. She replaced the small reflectors with a wider light shaft protected by a clear panel at the top of the hill. Slowly, the shelter improved. By Christmas, the floor remained dry after heavy snow. The entrance no longer froze shut, and pale daylight reached the sleeping chamber. Evelyn had stopped trying to prove that her original design was perfect. Instead, she allowed winter to show her where it was weak. And every time the hill failed, she listened, rebuilt, and made it stronger. The warning arrived on a gray morning in late January. Evelyn was carrying hay toward the shelter when the radio inside her cabin interrupted its usual farm report. A powerful winter system had formed beyond the northern mountains. It was expected to reach Pine Hollow within 48 hours. Heavy snow alone was not the greatest danger. The announcer warned of violent winds, rapidly falling temperatures, and drifting snow deep enough to block roads and bury low structures. Evelyn stopped in the doorway and listened until the message repeated. Across the valley, engines started before noon. Farmers hurried to reinforce doors, stack feed, and move equipment beneath roofs. Mr. Holloway and his sons climbed onto their red barn to secure several loose metal sheets. When Evelyn drove into town for supplies, she found the feed store crowded. "Big storm coming," the owner said as he loaded grain into her truck. "Some people say it could be the worst we've seen in 20 years. Near the counter, 2 farmers were discussing their barns. "Mine survived the storm of '09, one said. "It'll survive this." Mr. Holloway noticed Evelyn and glanced at the sacks piled in her truck. "Planning to hide in your hill with the goats?" A few men laughed. Evelyn looked through the window at the darkening sky. "That's the plan." Back at the farm, she worked without stopping. She filled the water barrels, carried enough hay and grain inside for several days, and checked every ventilation shaft for leaves, ice, or loose stones. Then she walked the hill above the shelter. Snowdrifts followed the wind, so she planted tall marker poles around the entrance and the upper vents. Even if the landscape disappeared beneath white, the poles would show her where to dig. She tested the inner gate, cleared both drainage channels, and tied a rope from the cabin to the shelter entrance. If visibility vanished, the rope would guide her safely between them. Before sunset, Evelyn brought the goats and sheep inside. The horses resisted at first, sensing the pressure change and the strange stillness in the air. She led them beneath the covered outer chamber and secured the heavy gate behind them. The animals were restless. So was she. By nightfall, the wind had begun to moan through the maple trees. Snow struck the cabin windows in sharp bursts. Evelyn checked the radio one final time. The storm had strengthened. The county advised everyone to remain indoors. Roads would close before midnight, and emergency crews might not reach isolated farms until the weather passed. Evelyn looked toward the hill, where a thin line of lantern light showed beneath the shelter door. For months, her neighbors had asked whether the hill could protect her animals from winter. Now winter was coming to answer them. The storm struck shortly after midnight. At first, snow moved across Pine Hollow in thin white sheets. Then the wind changed direction and slammed against the valley with a force that made Evelyn's cabin tremble. She stood beside the window, watching the world disappear. Within minutes, the fence posts vanished. The maple trees bent until their branches nearly touched the ground. Snow swept sideways so violently that Evelyn could no longer see the entrance to the hillside shelter. Only the rope tied around her waist showed her the way. Holding a lantern beneath her coat, she stepped outside. The cold stole her breath immediately. Wind pushed her sideways, and ice struck her face like grains of sand. Evelyn gripped the guide rope with both hands and followed it through the darkness. When she reached the hill, snow had already piled halfway up the outer door. She cleared the entrance, slipped inside, and pulled the heavy door shut behind her. The difference was immediate. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the sound became a distant, muffled growl. The goats and sheep crowded together on the raised platforms. The horses stood in the outer chamber, nervous but protected from the wind. Evelyn checked each animal, then examined the ventilation shafts. One was still drawing air. The other had begun to weaken. Snow was covering the upper outlet. Evelyn climbed through a narrow maintenance passage and pushed a wooden rod upward through the vent. The first attempt failed. Packed snow pressed down from above. She pushed again. A column of snow broke loose, and fresh air rushed through the shaft. Hours passed. Evelyn remained inside, listening to the hill. Occasionally, the ground vibrated as branches snapped or heavy drifts collapsed outside. Dust fell from one timber brace, but the supports held. Across the valley, the barns faced the full force of the storm. Sheets of metal tore from roofs and disappeared into the darkness. Wooden doors broke from their hinges. Snow gathered unevenly on broad rooftops, adding weight faster than anyone could remove it. Mr. Holloway and his sons tried to reach their red barn, but the wind forced them back toward the house. From the porch, they could only watch sections of the roof lift and slam down again. Beneath the hill, Evelyn sat among her animals with the lantern beside her. The shelter was not warm like a house, but it was dry, calm, and protected. The storm could strike the hillside as hard as it wanted. There was no roof for the wind to tear away. The storm weakened just before dawn. For the first time in hours, Evelyn could hear something other than wind. Snow still hissed across the hillside, but the violent shaking had stopped. She waited until the light outside turned from black to gray. Then she checked the animals again, filled their water troughs, and unlatched the inner gate. The outer door would not move. Snow had packed tightly against it during the night. Evelyn took the shovel stored beside the entrance and began digging through the narrow emergency opening she had built above the main door. Cold air rushed inside as she pushed the hatch outward. What she saw beyond it did not look like Pine Hollow. The fences were gone beneath the snow. The road had vanished. Only the tops of the tallest trees remained visible above the white drifts. Evelyn climbed out and cleared the main entrance from the outside. One by one, the animals stepped into the pale morning light. The goats blinked at the snowbanks. The sheep remained close to the doorway. Both horses were tired, but none of them appeared injured. The shelter had remained dry. The ventilation shafts were open. Every animal had survived. Then Evelyn looked across the valley. Mr. Holloway's red barn was no longer standing. A section of its roof lay twisted in the pasture. The central frame had collapsed beneath the uneven weight of the snow, leaving only one wall upright. Other barns along the county road had suffered the same fate. Some had lost roofs. Others were almost completely buried. From somewhere beyond the ridge came the faint sound of an animal calling. Evelyn went back inside, tied a coil of rope around her shoulder, and collected blankets, feed, and a small medical kit. She had barely reached the lower road when she saw Mr. Holloway and his sons digging through a drift beside their ruined barn. 2 cows had escaped into the storm. Several others were trapped behind a collapsed beam. For months, Mr. Holloway had treated Evelyn's hillside shelter as a joke. Now he looked at her without pride or laughter. "We need somewhere to put them," he said. Evelyn glanced toward the hill. "My shelter can take more." By midday, the same neighbors who had slowed their trucks to mock her were leading frightened animals toward the dark entrance in the hillside. Above them, snow covered nearly every roof in the valley. But the barn they could not see was still standing. By afternoon, the hillside shelter was no longer Evelyn's alone. Mr. Holloway arrived first with 3 cows and a calf. One of the cows limped from a cut along its front leg. Evelyn guided the animals into the outer chamber, spread fresh straw across the floor, and cleaned the wound with warm water. Soon, more figures appeared through the drifting snow. The Millers brought 6 sheep after the roof of their small barn collapsed. Old Thomas Reed arrived with 2 frightened mules. Another family led a pair of goats down the buried road, using fence wire as a rope because they had left home too quickly to find anything better. These were the same people who had called Evelyn's shelter a cave. Now they stood quietly beneath its timber supports, watching their animals settle into the dry warmth. No one laughed. Evelyn divided the chambers carefully. The injured and exhausted animals stayed nearest the entrance, where they could be checked easily. The sheep were placed together in the deeper section. Feed was measured so it would last until the roads reopened. The shelter had never been designed for so many animals. The air grew heavy, and the bedding became damp faster than before. Evelyn opened the secondary vents and asked the neighbors to clear snow from the outlet markers above the hill. For the first time, they followed her instructions without question. Mr. Holloway climbed the slope with a shovel. His sons carried fresh straw from the cabin. Mrs. Miller filled water buckets, while Thomas repaired a loose gate hinge. The people of Pine Hollow began working inside the hill as if it belonged to all of them. Near sunset, Mr. Holloway stood beside Evelyn at the entrance. Below them, the red barn lay broken beneath the snow. "I was wrong," he said. Evelyn kept her eyes on the animals. "You were afraid of something you had never seen before." He nodded slowly. "And you still helped us." She looked around the crowded shelter. "The animals didn't laugh at me." That answer silenced him. Throughout the night, neighbors took turns checking the livestock, clearing the vents, and carrying feed. The place once mocked as a useless hole became the safest building in the valley. The hill had protected Evelyn's animals. Now it was protecting the animals of everyone who had doubted her. 3 days after the storm, the county road finally reopened. A small team of inspectors arrived in Pine Hollow to assess the damage. They photographed collapsed roofs, broken gates, and barns leaning beneath the remaining snow. When they reached Evelyn's farm, one inspector looked across the white pasture. "Where's your barn?" he asked. Evelyn pointed toward the hillside. The inspector followed her to the entrance, expecting to find a crude cave. Instead, he stepped into a structured shelter with reinforced beams, raised bedding platforms, drainage channels, storage chambers, and separate ventilation shafts. The animals stood quietly inside. The walls were dry. Only then did the neighbors understand what Evelyn had actually built. Her shelter had survived, not because it was underground by accident, but because nearly every part of it had been shaped around the land. The entrance faced away from the strongest winter winds. The earth surrounding the chambers slowed sudden temperature changes. The curved hill directed much of the wind over the shelter rather than against a tall wall. Most importantly, there was no broad roof exposed above the ground. Traditional barns were designed to provide space, light, and easy access, but their large surfaces also gave violent wind and heavy snow something to push against. Evelyn's shelter had traded height for protection. It was not invincible. Poor drainage could have flooded it. Blocked vents could have endangered the animals. Weak supports could have caused a collapse. What saved it was not simply the hill. It was the months Evelyn had spent observing, testing, failing, and correcting every weakness before the great storm arrived. The inspector ran one hand along a stone-lined drainage trench. "This isn't a farm without a barn," he said. Mr. Holloway stood nearby, staring at the shelter door. "No," he replied quietly. "The whole hill is her barn." The sentence spread through Pine Hollow faster than the original jokes ever had. For months, people had judged Evelyn's farm by what they could not see. Now they understood that the strongest structure in the valley had been hidden in plain sight. By spring, Pine Hollow no longer looked like the valley Evelyn had first entered. The snow melted slowly, revealing broken roofs, twisted metal, and fields littered with timber. For weeks, the sound of hammers echoed from one farm to another as families rebuilt what the blizzard had destroyed. But they did not rebuild everything the same way. Mr. Holloway was the first to ask Evelyn for help. He stood beside the ruins of his red barn with a rolled set of plans beneath his arm. "I don't want another building that only looks strong," he said. "I want one that understands the land." Together, they designed a lower barn protected by the natural slope behind his pasture. The roof was steeper, the walls were better braced, and a reinforced emergency shelter was built partially into the hillside. Other neighbors soon followed. The Millers improved their drainage channels and added raised sleeping areas for their sheep. Thomas Reed built windbreaks and a smaller, earth-covered shelter for his mules. Families who had once laughed at Evelyn now walked across her farm with notebooks, asking about ventilation, water flow, and snowdrifts. Evelyn never told them to copy her design exactly. "Every hill behaves differently," she explained. "Watch where the wind travels. Watch where water gathers. Let the animals show you where they feel safe." By summer, the valley had changed. The rebuilt farms were not identical, but each one worked more closely with the landscape. Barns stood lower. Trees were planted as windbreaks. Emergency feed and water were stored in protected spaces. At the center of it all, Evelyn's hillside shelter remained simple and nearly invisible beneath the grass. One evening she stood above it as her goats wandered across the slope. From there, she could see the new roofs scattered throughout Pine Hollow. Mr. Holloway stopped beside her. "We thought you had built nothing," he said. Evelyn smiled. "I built what the land allowed me to build." Below them, children ran between the farms, while neighbors repaired fences together. The storm had destroyed buildings, but it had also broken something else, the certainty that old methods were always the safest ones. Evelyn had arrived as the woman with no barn. Now the valley remembered her as the woman who taught them that strength did not always rise above the ground. Sometimes, it waited quietly beneath their feet.